So Naomi and Ruth have returned from Moab to Bethlehem. And in a sense, these two ladies, they're quite different. You've got you've got Naomi, who is, she's an inhabitant of Bethlehem. She was brought up in Bethlehem. She knows one end of Bethlehem from the other. She knows its streets. She knows the people. She's familiar with it. She has a history. She has a history of worshipping Jehovah. And she has a lot of experience under her belt of living with the people of God. Yes, admittedly, her experience has left her sore and bitter, to use her word, and probably exhausted. And by comparison, her companion, Ruth, she's quite different. Ruth is young, a generation younger. Ruth is a stranger. She has no history. She is a fresh convert to Jehovah. And she's unfamiliar with the ways of God, and she's unfamiliar with the ways of the people of God. She doesn't really know how they tick. She's not really been used to living in this type of place, this type of environment. But she has joined them. She now considers herself to be one of them. And she comes not with bitterness, but she comes with an experience like most new converts do, of joy and of enthusiasm. And it's always fantastic to welcome a new convert, a new believer, into the people of God, because they come with this joy, they come with this excitement, they come with this enthusiasm. And I wonder, what's it like for the new believer to come in to a chapel where probably most of the people that are there have been Christians a long time and have got a lot of experience under the belt? And I want us to think about this relationship this morning between Naomi and Ruth and how it's expressed here in the first few verses of chapter 2. So we see firstly Ruth's request. Ruth's request. There in verse 2. Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. Now, Ruth is essentially asking, can she go to the field to gather the ears of corn after the reapers? Now, Ruth is like any new believer. They take God at his word. And they say, right, well, if that's what God said, that's what I'm going to do. And there is this freshness about the way that new believers respond and work things out. Now, whether Ruth was aware of the provisions that the Mosaic law made for people in her condition, we don't really know. But what she is asking, what she is proposing, the idea that she's got, is fully in line with exactly what was there in the law. So if you go back to Leviticus chapter 19, we read these words. God told Moses, When you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And by the gleanings, it means the bits that fall to the ground. Don't collect them all up. Thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. And that's repeated again in Deuteronomy. So chapter 24, verse 19, we read these words. And when thou cuttest down thine harvest in thy field, and hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hands. Now, who was the gleanings for? The stranger, the widow, the fatherless, and the poor. Who was Ruth? A poor, stranger, and a widow. She had 3 out of the 4 qualifications. She was well qualified to go to the field and to gather the gleanings of the harvest. And you know, many believers, new believers, they take God at his word. They say, right, well, if that's the provision, that's what I'm going to do. And she makes this request, therefore, to go and to glean. Now, I want us to think a little bit about this. So, going to glean was not easy. And it wasn't easy for a number of reasons. The first of them was it was backbreaking. You're bending right over. It's not like cutting down the corn where you can hold the corn by the top and chop it off. No, this is picking the corn up from the ground. This is back-breaking work. And very hard work, because you pick up one ear of corn and you've got a little bit. Whereas if you grab a whole load of it and chop it down, you've got loads. It was slow, laborious, back-breaking work. And Naomi clearly wasn't fit for that. She was an older woman. But Ruth, well, she's younger. She said, well, I'm sure I can do that. And maybe I can provide even for Naomi as well. So that's the first thing. It was physically difficult work. But secondly, notice how she puts it in verse 2. Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace or favour. And maybe Ruth has got the impression that as a stranger, she may not be that well received. It's interesting that she is referred to as Ruth the Moabitess in verse 2. And then Boaz's servant calls her the Moabitish woman. She's not one of us. She's one of them. And maybe there was a sense of that she kind of didn't quite know how she was going to be received. And you know, it's a sad thing when new Christians are not well received in the church. And it does happen. And we need to make sure it doesn't happen here. Ruth is looking for a friendly face. Effectively, that's what she's about. Thirdly, this work was extremely menial. Only the most impoverished went to the field to glean the ears of corn. This was scrapping for life on the very edge. This was scrapping for existence. This really was hand to mouth. And maybe Ruth senses some of the kind of social shame of that. And she realizes that going to glean may be exposing not just herself but Naomi and their actual condition to the villagers in Bethlehem and even to Naomi's own family members, her relatives. And maybe Ruth is kind of sensitive to that, and maybe that's what lies behind her request, that she didn't just kind of branch out and do her own thing, but she says, oh, Mum, do you think I can do this? She doesn't really want to expose Naomi unnecessarily. And it's great. You can see Ruth. She's got this wonderful mix of humility and respect, energy, enthusiasm. She's got this can-do spirit, and they all kind of mix together, and it's really great to see. Now I want to ask us as a company of God's people, how do we cope when a new Christian joins us? Somebody who's freshly come to faith, somebody who's newly converted, somebody who brings all their enthusiasm with them and their ideas about how they and we could serve God. And they're very upfront about their ideas. And maybe some of those ideas might sound a bit naive to those who are more experienced. Maybe we think, oh, we better not do that. That will expose us to a bit of ridicule in the community. What do we do? How do we respond? How do we react? Now, a few years ago, I went on a beach mission up in Llandudno. And I hadn't been for a little while, and I arrived. And in the main room, as you came into the house on the right-hand side there was a young guy, strumming a guitar and singing something from the Beatles. And he had a big Elvis quiff at the front. I thought, oh no, what have I come to? What is going on here? Anyway, I got to know this young lad, and he'd only been a Christian a year or so, but he was there to serve God. And my brother, who was leading the teams, asked this lad, would he sing at the open air on the prom in the evening? So he went down with his guitar and he sang the gospel in an Elvis genre. Now, it was a little bit strange to me, I must admit. But you know what? God was in it. There was something amazingly sweet about it. His heart was really engaged. He was desperate to serve God. And my brother had the wisdom to see how he could use him. And I think most of us would find that a bit uncomfortable. But, you know, this is what we need to be thinking about in terms of how we serve God and how we utilise the energy and enthusiasm. Say somebody comes in among us who's got sporting ability, and they say, well, could I run football coaching lessons with a gospel message at the end in the village? We say, well, can't find football in the Bible. These are the kind of questions we need to start thinking about, and how do we do this? How do we respond? Well, we need to see how Naomi responded. So we've seen Ruth's request. We now need to see Naomi's not, because that is exactly what she does. There it is, verse 2. She said unto her, go, my daughter. Go, my daughter. Now listen, the last time Naomi spoke to Ruth that's recorded in Scripture, she was saying, go back, go back. Now she's saying, go out there. Go on, go out there. Off you go for it. Now sometimes we as mature believers, we're good at the go back. And we can be quite discouraging. We can be quite negative towards new Christians. And we shouldn't be. We can be dampening their spirits, pouring cold water on them, and especially on their enthusiasm. Now, why is it that we tend to respond in that way? What is it about a new convert that kind of makes us kind of a bit edgy? I think there are a number of things. One of them is that the enthusiasm of a new convert often rebukes us about our own spiritual lethargy and tiredness. Maybe there's a bit of deadness that's crept into our faith. Maybe it's even come to bankruptcy. And the enthusiasm, the life that new converts have, it kind of, whoa, where am I in comparison to that? Maybe too, the new convert with their enthusiasm reminds us of our own youthful enthusiasm. It reminds us of where we were once and the joy of first love that we once had, that maybe now has long ago slipped away. Maybe we're envious of them. Maybe we wish we had what they got secretly, but we wouldn't say it. Maybe too, we kind of cast our minds back to the time when we were a new Christian, and we kind of shudder and blush at some of the gaffes we made. And we're thinking, oh no, I hope they don't make the same mistakes that we made. And so we kind of say, no, don't do that. Maybe as we get older, we struggle to come to terms with the fact that we can't do what we used to do. And that's a difficult place. To realise that physically I can't do what I once did, like Naomi. And what that means is now I am actually dependent on other people, maybe on young believers. Maybe I'm dependent on someone who can do what I can't do. But Naomi, bless her, she seems to have none of those hang-ups. She says, go, my daughter, go. Whether she said go with a kind of bit of nervousness, I don't know what's going to happen, I don't know. Whether she stayed at home praying, we don't know, but she encouraged her in this initiative. She wanted to harness Ruth's enthusiasm. And you know, that word go, what blessing it brought to them. It did. And really, this is the kind of low point. And from here, we begin to see Naomi picking up and rising up again from the low point that she was really at. So by the end of the chapter, we hear Naomi saying, blessed be he of the Lord who hath not left off his kindness to the living and the dead. She's beginning to see the Lord's hand in all this, and it's beginning to restore the joy to her heart. It's a wonderful collaboration between an older woman and a younger, less experienced but enthusiastic woman. It's a powerful combination, and the Bible often presents to us such combinations. You have a Moses and a Joshua. You have an Elijah and an Elisha. You have a Paul and a Timothy. And God is able to use those sorts of combinations with great effect for his glory. Now, you're an older Christian. Maybe you've been a Christian some time. You've been on the road quite some while. Are you seeking to draw near to a new believer, a younger believer, and to harness them, to form a relationship that kind of is able to do much for God? Think, look around, see what you can do, and see how you can help a younger believer in that. So we've seen Ruth's request, Naomi's nod. But we need to see God's guidance. God's guidance. You see, Ruth leaves, and there's something very deliberate about the first part of verse 3. She went and came and gleaned. Ruth was not going to be distracted. She was very determined. She set about doing this, and she was going to do it. But when she arrives at the field, she's got a bit of a problem. Now, in the ancient world, the way they used to do it, the village was walled, but outside the village was a huge expanse of land. Remember, Bethlehem was the breadbasket of Israel. That's what it means, house of bread. This huge expanse of land, and it was divided into strips, and each householder owned a strip, and that was the bit that they cultivated. So she comes to the edge of the huge field. Well, it's a hive of activity. There's reapers all over the place. There's gleaners. There's people going backwards and forwards, taking the stuff that had been harvested back into the village. It was a hive of bustling activity. And she must have thought, whoa, hold on, where do I start? Where do I start here? One plot looked as good as another. And notice how the writer puts it. Her hap was to light on the part of the field belonging to Boaz. It was Boaz's strip of land. But her hap was, literally, her hap happened. It looked like chance. It looked as if there was no rhyme or reason to her choice. She said, that one. I'll go for that one. And she starts in this strip of land. There's no plan to it, as far as she's concerned. There's no premeditation to it. And she has no idea whose strip of land she started gleaning on, whose plot she's chosen, and the significance of that. She had no idea that this plot belonged to a relative of her late father-in-law. Everything appears random. But as you carry on reading through the book, it becomes clear that this is anything other than random. This is not random at all. We see from subsequent history, even from the subsequent history of redemption, that this isn't random. She can't see it. She's just picking a strip of land. But God sees it. And this is part of his plan. This is the work of the master weaver. This is the work of the divine hand making the divine tapestry of the world and its history and of the history of redemption. Here we see her hap was the hand of God weaving the thread through the back of the tapestry and bringing it out into Boaz's strip of land. This is God at work. This is God's providing hand. This is God's providence. Now, providence isn't something that we think much of. Our forefathers thought a lot of providence. If you read the letters and speeches of Oliver Cromwell, they are littered with providence. Providence, the providence of God, was big in his thinking, as it was in many of our Puritan forefathers. But as our society loses sight of God and providence, our society resorts to lady luck and chance meeting and coincidence. Now listen, although this looks perfectly random, this is no lady luck. This is God at work, preparing his plan, working out his plan, and you will see it come to fruition in the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Now listen, in the society and the days in which we're living, there is nothing that appears more random than COVID-19. It does. It looks random as to who gets it. And it looks pretty random as to who dies from it. Okay, there are some people who appear more susceptible than others. The old, the obese, diabetics, people with respiratory issues. But that's not the full story, is it? It appears pretty random. It appears like the rolling of a dice. And it makes us fear. It makes our society fear. They may not admit it openly, but there is a fear abroad in our society. A fear of COVID. Listen to the word of our God. The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord. It's as random as casting lots or as tossing a dice. But the disposing, the way this works out, is from him. He is in control. He's even in control of what seem insignificant events. At the moment in my personal devotions, I'm reading through the book of Esther. And if ever there was a book that looked like there was a whole sequence of random stuff, that's it. I mean, you have the Queen, Esther, inviting the king for a banquet, and he says, well, what do you want? She says, come back tomorrow. I think, what? What are you doing? Why don't you just tell him? No, that's part of God's plan. Because overnight, he's not going to sleep. And so he calls for some random book to be read to him about what's gone on and in the history recently. And they read this random bit about, it's about Esther's, well, he's not really he's an uncle, Mordecai, and, well, what's that got to do with it? Oh, well, he brings him in, and there's this whole thing about parading him through the street. Well, what's that all that about? And then there's the next feast. And then all of that is preparing the king to receive the message from Esther. It's all preparatory work. God is in control. He's not mentioned in Esther. There's no mention of him. But he's clearly behind it. He is still controlling it. Listen, my friends, we have a God in heaven who is in control. Paul puts it like this in Romans. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Providence. There are bright providences and there are dark providences. But they are all his providences. And you know, I look back over my life and there are times when I have failed to see the providence of God. And you know what that does? it breeds frustration, and it breeds anger, and it breeds, "Ugh, no, I shouldn't have done that." The providence of God. And once we have stopped our huffing and puffing, and we've understood that God is in control, and once that has migrated from our heads in the theory of it to our hearts in the reality of it, it brings us much peace and much confidence, because we know that in the confusion of our lives, God is working out his purpose. So there we have it. Ruth's request, Naomi's nod, and God's guidance. Listen, I know they seem a bit disparate, but may these thoughts be a blessing to our hearts this morning. Amen.
Amen.